A Roman coin was found on a Japanese island. There are 25 artifacts like this, each one discovered thousands of miles from where it should be. They are pieces of a puzzle, a global puzzle we're just beginning to solve, and it shows a map of human history, a map that's more connected, more adventurous than any textbook shows. An Egyptian object in an ancient American tomb, a Norse coin in the forests of Maine. These relics hold stories. They challenge our assumptions about isolated ancient worlds. To find something that shouldn't be there, what does that really mean? A bronze coin was found in the soil of a Japanese castle. It was small, about the size of a fingertip. And it wasn't Japanese, it was Roman, minted in the 4th century with the faded image of Emperor Constantine II. It was found under the ruins of Katsuran Castle on Okinawa. That's thousands of miles from Rome, so the question is how it got there. The simple answer is trade, but not a direct trade. It's more about these sprawling, indirect networks that connected continents. Long before modern maps, historians think it probably traveled the Silk Road, that ancient highway for commerce and culture. It would have passed from a Roman merchant to a Persian trader. Then maybe to a Central Asian caravan moving into China. From China, it could have gone onto a ship, a Chinese or Korean ship, navigating the routes that linked the mainland to the island chains of Japan. This wasn't a single voyage, it was a relay race across generations. The coin changed hands dozens of times, maybe hundreds, its value shifting from currency to a curiosity. A trinket from a world of legend. For the people of Katsuran Castle, which was itself a powerful trading hub, this foreign object might have been a prized exotic item. A symbol of far-reaching connections, its discovery breaks the simpler story of an isolated, feudal Japan. It suggests a more globally aware archipelago, where local rulers valued artifacts from the distant West. It makes us reconsider ancient globalization. Was it a world of isolated civilizations, or one of subtle, persistent threads linking empires and islands? That Roman coin in Okinawan soil isn't just an anomaly, it's a silent witness. It asks us to look at the ordinary objects around us and wonder what epic journey the simplest thing might have taken to get here. That Roman coin in Japan is one thing, but there's another coin found here in North America, in Maine, at a coastal Native American settlement. Archaeologists dug up a small silver disc. A penny, but it wasn't American, it was Norse, minted between 1065 and 1080, during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre of Norway. That's the late 11th century. Nearly 400 years before Columbus, they found it at the Goddard site, a confirmed pre-Columbian village, and that sent shockwaves through history. A stamped European coin in North America, long before any documented contact. It's called the Maine penny, and it's one of the most tantalizing pieces of evidence for a Norse presence here. We know the sagas, the stories passed down. They talk about explorers like Leif Erikson, a land they called Vinland, west of Greenland, and archaeology proved that. At Elant's Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, a Norse settlement was there around the year 1000, but the Maine penny pushes further. Did they go farther south? Along the Atlantic coast, the coin's condition tells a story. It was worn, it showed signs of being handled, it wasn't new, it wasn't just dropped, it had a life before Maine. A journey, how did it get there? One theory is direct trade. A Norse explorer from a Vinland expedition, trading it to a Native American person, maybe for furs or food. In that case, it wasn't currency, it was a curious object, a piece of shiny silver, a pendant or a charm. The other theory is the indigenous trade networks. Those long-distance routes across the continent. The coin could have been acquired in the Arctic from a Norse settler in Greenland, then traveled south. Through countless hands over decades, maybe a century, passed from group to group until it reached the coast of Maine, and where they found it adds another layer. It was buried in the soil of a hearth area, a place of daily life. That means it was there when the Wabanaki people used the site. That makes a modern accident very unlikely. So for many, the Maine penny is a cornerstone, a tiny, stubborn piece of metal. It doesn't fit the old story. It makes you think about the fragments that survive. Against time and weather and chance, this one coin endured. It's a physical bridge between two worlds, history kept separate, a Norse king's face on silver. Found in the soil of a Native American home, waiting centuries to tell its story of a connected Atlantic world. A coin is one thing, but then you have a god. Small stone carvings, figures said to be the Egyptian god Osiris. They show up in stories in private collections, said to come from the soil at old Aztec sites. That claim, it's a big one. It would mean a direct link between the pharaohs and the pyramids here. It's the kind of thing that feeds stories of lost civilizations, ancient voyages. And according to modern archaeology, it's almost certainly not true. This is where things turn. The story of these figurines, it shows why you have to separate a good story from actual fact. The first problem is provenance. In archaeology, provenance is everything. It's the documented history of an object, where it was found exactly, what layer of earth. What else was found with it? For these figurines, that record is unclear. They usually appear in private hands with vague origins. They lack the careful context a real dig provides. Without that, an artifact is just a curious object. Its real story is gone. A lot of these items turn out to be modern, or they're genuine antiquities that were moved, sold, mislabeled much later. This brings up a bigger debate: diffusionism versus independent invention. Diffusionism says cultural traits, like building pyramids, spread from one source through contact. Independent invention says different cultures facing similar human needs can come up with similar answers on their own. The pyramids are the classic example. You look at them and think there must be a shared plan, but anthropologists point out the deep differences. Egyptian pyramids were tombs sealed shut. Mesoamerican pyramids were working temples with stairs leading to the top for worship. Their forms and functions developed separately. The similarity is in the human mind. The drive to build upward toward the sky using the most stable shape they knew, the triangle. So where does that leave the Osiris figures? They're at the far end of diffusionist thought. A line of thinking that often skips evidence for a better story. Experts in pre-Columbian studies are clear. There's no verified evidence, no peer-reviewed find of an ancient Egyptian artifact in a sealed pre-Columbian layer in the Americas. Not one. The material record doesn't support it. This isn't about closing doors, it's about rigor. Archaeology is slow. It builds knowledge brick by brick, each brick a verified find. To take an unverified figurine as proof rewrites history on shaky ground, and it disrespects the real achievements of the Aztec, the Maya, other cultures. They were brilliant innovators themselves. They didn't need a foreign blueprint to create their wonders. So this artifact or this claim, it teaches a balance. You have to question extraordinary claims, demand evidence, understand how real science works, but you also have to stay open to extraordinary possibilities. The Maine penny shows real outliers can exist. The difference is in the proof. It's the difference between a story we want to be true and a truth that tells us a new story. Our next find walks that line, an object so out of place its very existence was argued about for decades. The evidence can be stubborn. There's a site in central Mexico, Calixtlahuaca. It was a Matlatzinca city later taken by the Aztecs. In 1933, an archaeologist named José Garcia Payon was working a burial. He found a small terracotta head. Just a few inches tall, but the features were clear, a trimmed, stylized beard. The hair was in a distinct style, locks brushed forward over the forehead. To anyone who knows classical art, it looks Roman, specifically from the Severan period, late 2nd century, early 3rd, and the records say it came from a sealed layer under a temple platform. A layer dated to between 900 and 1300, well before any Spanish contact, a Roman artifact in pre-Hispanic Mexico. The implications are huge. This is the Tlaxcala head. It's been debated for decades, heated debate. The core question is simple. Is it real or is it a mistake? Contamination is possible. Could a colonial object have fallen into that ancient layer? Or was it a hoax planted during the dig itself? Those are the first questions, but the head resists easy dismissal. In the 1990s, scientists used thermoluminescence dating. It measures when the clay was last fired. The results dated its creation to between the 9th and 13th centuries. That's firmly pre-Columbian. That test gave it a powerful claim to legitimacy. So if it's authentic, how did it get there? The distance is immense, an object from the Mediterranean in a burial in central Mexico over 1,000 years ago. The theories split. The first is direct trans-Pacific contact. Could a Roman ship blown off course have crossed the Atlantic and down the coast? Or, given the hairstyle, maybe a later voyage from Asia? A Chinese or Arab vessel crossing the Pacific, the head then entering trade networks as a curiosity. The other camp argues for coincidence. They say the beard and hairstyle, while reminiscent of Roman art, could be a local representation. An elderly man or a wind or water deity. They point out beards are rare in Mesoamerican art but not unknown. Scholars are cautious. Mainstream archaeology doesn't accept it as definitive proof. A single artifact isn't enough to rewrite history. The original dig's stratigraphy is questioned. The context isn't documented to modern standards, yet the head persists. It sits in a museum, a ghost from another world. It refuses to be explained away. It forces you to hold two ideas at once. You have to respect the rigorous standards that protect history from speculation. But you also have to stay open to the possibility that our maps are incomplete, that the oceans, these vast barriers, were for some potential highways. This terracotta head, with its quiet expression, challenges the narrative of total pre-Columbian isolation. It asks a question. Is it more likely that two cultures, a world apart, randomly sculpted the same specific hairstyle? Or is it more likely we've underestimated the ancient world's reach? The answer may be lost, but the question reshapes how you look at every other out-of-place artifact. It turns suspicion into a spark of curiosity. You can debate a single piece of evidence, but sometimes it doesn't come as one piece. It comes as a million. All along the coast of East Africa, from Kenya down into Tanzania, the beaches there and the sites of old cities, they're paved with history. You walk the shores near the ancient Swahili ports. Kilwa, Mombasa, you find it right under your feet, shards of pottery, but not just any pottery. These are fragments of fine porcelain, glazed a brilliant white. Painted with intricate designs in cobalt blue, flowers and dragons and landscapes, this is Ming Dynasty porcelain from China from the 14th to the 17th centuries. And there's so much of it. Archaeologists have a name for these places. They call them China beaches. This isn't a stray artifact. It's a deluge, evidence for a trade network of staggering scale. A pre-modern internet, the Indian Ocean world. For centuries, Chinese merchant ships sailed these waters. Arab dhows, Indian vessels. They carried spices and ivory and gold and textiles. And from China, they carried porcelain. This wasn't just tableware. It was a technological marvel, a luxury product, revered everywhere for its strength. For its glass-like finish, for its beauty. The most famous type is the blue and white ware, made with cobalt pigment imported from Persia. painted on white clay and fired at incredible heat. For the Swahili elites living in those stone towns along the African coast, this porcelain was more than a useful import. It was a powerful status symbol. Displaying a piece of Ming porcelain in your home announced your connection. It spoke of your place in a vast, cosmopolitan world of trade. It meant wealth and taste and reach. This trade reached a kind of peak in the early 15th century under a man named Zheng He, a Chinese admiral and diplomat. Zheng He led enormous treasure fleets on voyages of exploration. His largest ships were behemoths, many times the size of anything sailing in Europe at the time. These fleets had hundreds of vessels, tens of thousands of men. They sailed from China across the Indian Ocean. Historical records suggest they reached the coast of East Africa. They brought gifts from the Chinese emperor. And they sought exotic goods like giraffes, which were taken back to the imperial court. Not every piece of porcelain came directly from these fleets. But their voyages cemented a direct link. They showed the distance between China and Africa wasn't an impassable barrier. It was a navigable highway. And the integration of this porcelain went far beyond just owning it. In places like the Great Mosque of Kilwa, archaeologists found these ceramic shards set right into the walls, into the arches used as decorative inlay to catch the light. Imagine a wall of white coral stone, studded with flashes of blue and white porcelain, a permanent public display of prestige and of piety. Families also curated collections, passing down prized bowls and plates through generations. Sometimes a piece would break, and it would be carefully repaired with metal staples, a testament to its valued place in the household. This widespread, enduring presence tells a clear story. It wasn't a brief contact, it wasn't accidental, it was a sustained conversation between continents, lasting for hundreds of years. The China beaches are a physical record of a globalized past. They remind us that the desire for beautiful, exotic things is a deeply human constant, and the networks built to obtain them. Long before modern shipping containers, luxury goods were making epic journeys, weaving the aesthetics of one world into the daily life of another. And this exchange wasn't one-sided. African gold flowed east, ivory, other materials, shaping economies and cultures there too. It was a true exchange, a reminder that history is rarely about isolated cultures. It's about constant connections, often unseen, and sometimes the proof of those connections is lying in the sand, waiting to be seen, not as a broken piece of pottery, but as a fragment of a much larger story. There's a lot of porcelain found along African coasts. That points to a regular trade system, something established. But then there's the other kind of find. An object that's completely alone, one artifact that, if it's real, wouldn't just cross geographic lines, it would break our whole timeline for civilization. In Bolivia, up in the highlands near Lake Titicaca, a farmer found a large stone bowl. This was back around the 1950s. It came to be called the Fuente Magna. And it's one of the most disputed objects in the world. The bowl is a ceremonial vessel, but its surface is covered with carvings, intricate work. And those carvings are what started the debate, a debate that's gone on for decades. They look like writing. To some researchers, they look remarkably close to ancient scripts from the other side of the world, Proto-Sumerian cuneiform from Mesopotamia. And then another set of symbols that resemble writing from the Indus Valley. The implication is huge. It could mean a link between the cradle of civilization in the Middle East and early cultures in the Andes. Thousands of years before any known contact happened. Supporters of this idea call it Bolivia's Rosetta Stone. They point to linguistic analyses where independent researchers say they've translated parts of the inscriptions. The translations often mention a goddess or rituals phrases that would fit right into Mesopotamian temple texts. The theory is that a group of Sumerian or other Old World explorers crossed the Atlantic, or maybe the Pacific, and brought their language and culture to South America. It's a story that meets a deep desire, the desire to see all human achievement as one connected story, coming from a single, shared origin. Mainstream archaeology, though, looks at the Fuente Magna with deep skepticism. The criticisms are methodical. They're severe. First and most damaging is the total lack of archaeological context. The bowl wasn't found by archaeologists in a controlled dig. It was a surface find, no documented layers in the ground, no other artifacts found with it to date it, no soil samples. Its entire history before it appeared is unknown. That makes authenticating it almost impossible. Second, experts in cuneiform and ancient scripts often dismiss the inscriptions as amateurish. They say the symbols are a jumble. They mimic the general shape of known writing, but they lack the grammatical structure, the consistent set of signs, the stylistic hallmarks of real proto-cuneiform. To a specialist, it looks like someone copied symbols from a book without understanding the language system behind them. The third major point is the question of motive. The idea of a grand, forgotten transoceanic civilization is very appealing. It creates a powerful story, a story that can attract attention, funding, a sense of revolutionary discovery. That creates a fertile ground for forgeries, whether they're intentional or born from a sincere but misguided attempt to prove a beloved theory. The Fuente Magna sits at the center of a passionate conflict. On one side, you have established academic institutions. They demand rigorous evidence, peer review, reproducible context. Their caution is the bedrock of historical knowledge. It's a guard against rewriting the past based on wishful thinking. On the other side, you have independent researchers and alternative theorists. They see that same caution as closed-mindedness. They argue that academia is too invested in the existing narrative to accept disruptive evidence, no matter how compelling. The bowl becomes more than an artifact. It becomes a symbol, a battleground over who gets to tell the human story. This debate shows something fundamental, our deep need to find patterns, to see connections across time and space. We are storytellers by nature. We long for a past that's epic and interconnected. The Fuente Magna, whether it's an ancient miracle or a modern mystery, taps right into that longing. It forces a difficult question. Are we interpreting the faint traces of a real, forgotten connection, or are we seeing the reflection of our own hopes in the weathered stone? The line between a documented find and a persistent story is thin. There's a story that comes up about the Great Lakes. It's about a Viking sword found at the bottom of Lake Michigan. The story says it was pulled up by a dredging operation, an iron blade coming out of the silt. They describe a classic Norse design, a wide blade with that central groove, the fuller, to lighten it. A simple crossguard, a pommel that might be the lobed or Brazil nut style. If it were real, it would be monumental, but here's the thing. After decades of this story, no museum has it. No archaeological journal has published it. There are no verified photographs. It's an artifact of story, not science. That doesn't make the idea impossible. It opens a real historical question. Could the Norse have reached the Great Lakes? We know they were at Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland. The sagas hint at expeditions farther inland. They talk about sailing up rivers, a land with grapes and timber. The highways into the continent are the river systems. A determined group in their Norse ships could have navigated from the Atlantic up the St. Lawrence into the Great Lakes. Lake Michigan is connected to Lake Huron. It's reachable by water, a long journey but not unimaginable for those explorers, so the plausibility is there. A Norse expedition, a trading party maybe in the 11th century, a sword lost overboard in a storm or offered as a ritual gift could settle in the lakebed for centuries. The design would be unmistakable. Viking swords weren't crude. They were sophisticated, pattern-welded, often from Frankish workshops, prized possessions. Finding one in the Great Lakes wouldn't just be contact, it would be penetration deep into the continent. It would change the map, yet experts treat the story with caution. The reason is the standard of verification. Today, a legend can spread globally in an instant, stripped of context. A real find of this size would follow a path. Reported to authorities, studied by metallurgists for composition and age, the sediment it was found in would be analyzed, every step documented and debated. The absence of that process for scholars is the most telling fact. This story, whether it's a misidentification, a hoax, or a lost discovery, shows something. It shows how the idea of the far-traveled artifact lives in the imagination. It fits a narrative we find compelling: the lone explorer, the lost relic, the hidden truth. These are the elements of legend. They speak to a desire for mystery in the past, for stories grander than pottery shards and post holes. The tale persists because it's a good story. And sometimes that power can remind us to look more carefully at the facts we do have, waiting to be assembled into a truth that is, in its own way, even more astonishing. There's this line between story and evidence. It's a kind of landscape, and in that landscape, some objects are so big they become the terrain itself. You find them in the humid lowlands of Mexico's Gulf Coast, the colossal stone heads of the Olmec civilization. They're giants, carved from single blocks of volcanic basalt. Some stand nearly 10 feet tall. They weigh many tons. Their faces are serene but powerful, broad features, full lips, distinctively flattened noses. They wear what look like close-fitting helmets. For decades, these striking faces have fueled one of history's most persistent speculations, because to some observers, these faces don't look Native American. They look to them African. That visual resemblance sparked a theory. Could there have been an ancient transatlantic voyage? Did people from Africa reach the Americas over 3,000 years ago and influence the Olmec, the so-called mother culture of Mesoamerica? It's a compelling idea on the surface. It speaks to a desire to see our entire story as interconnected from the beginning. Mainstream archaeology grounds this in a different context. The Olmec flourished from around 1,200 to 400 before the Common Era. Their heartland was in what are now the Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco. They built the first major cities in the region, San Lorenzo, La Venta. They developed a complex calendar, a system of writing, monumental architecture. They're widely recognized as the foundational culture for all later Mesoamerican societies. The Maya, the Aztecs, these heads are their signature achievement. So who do the heads represent? The overwhelming scholarly consensus is their portraits of individual Olmec rulers. The helmets are actually protective headgear worn for the ritual bowl game. A central part of Olmec political and spiritual life, each head is unique. That suggests they commemorate specific leaders, perhaps erected during their reign or as memorials after their passing. But what about those features? Art historians and anthropologists point to artistic convention. Olmec sculptors worked with extremely hard stone. Their tools were other stones, water, and abrasive sand. Creating fine, narrow features in that medium was incredibly difficult. The broad, rounded forms are a practical adaptation to the material, and the stylistic choice likely emphasized qualities the Olmec associated with power. Strength, stability, a connection to the earth and to the jaguar, a sacred animal often shown with a similar broad, flat nose. The question of physical appearance is also addressed locally. Skeletal remains and genetic studies from Olmec sites show a population consistent with other early indigenous groups in the Americas. The diversity of facial features among indigenous peoples is vast. The Olmec likely depicted a range that was familiar to them. The heads may represent an idealized type, not a photographic likeness, blending human and divine attributes. This isn't about dismissing curiosity, it's about the methodology of interpretation. When we see a resemblance across oceans, the first step isn't to invent a voyage. It's to look deeply at the artifact's home. What materials were used? What local traditions does it draw from? What purpose did it serve in its own society? For the Olmec heads, every answer points inward to their quarries, their rituals, their social structure. The lesson here is profound. It teaches us to distinguish between the instinct to see connection and the disciplined work of proving historical contact. The heads remind us that cultures are inventive on their own. They can arrive at similar artistic solutions or emphasize similar symbols of power without any outside influence. The awe we feel looking at them isn't diminished by understanding them as a local achievement. In fact, it's amplified. It means a people working with stone and sheer will created one of the ancient world's most iconic art forms from their own genius. The mystery isn't where they came from, it's how they imagined and then carved such enduring majesty from solid rock. Silver and gold moved far from the Mediterranean. They were carried over mountains and deserts by merchants and soldiers, and they ended up in places that might seem unlikely, like northern India along the riverbanks and old city sites. Archaeologists have found hordes of ancient Greek coins there, not just one or two, collections buried for safekeeping. These aren't accidents, they're evidence of a major collision of cultures and the fusion that came after it. It starts with Alexander the Great. In the 4th century BCE, his army marched east. They built an empire from Greece to the borders of India. They brought more than soldiers. They brought a whole cultural world, Greek language, Greek art, Greek ideas about cities and government, and Greek coins. When Alexander reached the Indus Valley, his silver coins entered the economy there. They had images of Heracles or Zeus, but Alexander's empire broke apart after he died. His generals divided it, and in the farthest eastern parts, something happened. Greek rulers held onto power in what's now Afghanistan, Pakistan, northwest India. They became kings of the Indo-Greek kingdoms. These weren't short-lived. They lasted for centuries, from about 180 BC to around 10 CE. And here, the coins become more than money. They become a canvas, a political tool. The Indo-Greek kings ruled a mixed population. Greek settlers, Persian-influenced peoples, local Indian communities, so they minted coins that spoke to everyone. One side might show the Greek king's profile with a diadem, inscriptions in Greek, but the other side, the reverse, shows Indian symbols, often an elephant, a symbol of royalty and strength in Indian tradition. Or a humped bull, a sacred animal. Sometimes the Greek goddess Athena appears, but holding a spear in a way that recalls the Indian goddess Lakshmi. The inscriptions on this side are in a local script like Kharosthi. Translating the king's name, experts see this as deliberate statecraft. It was propaganda. Putting Greek and Indian images on the same silver piece sent a message. The king was asserting his authority in a way both groups could accept. He was saying, I am part of both worlds. I respect your traditions. I rule here. Economically, these silver and gold coins brought stability. They enabled trade across a huge, culturally mixed region, from Central Asia down into India. They were a common language of value. The most famous ruler was Menander I, King Milinda in Indian texts. His coins are the peak of this fusion. They show a king engaged in the philosophical dialogues of his Indian realm. His widespread coinage tells us his kingdom was a place of exchange for goods and for ideas. So when a hoard of these coins is found in India today, it's not out of place. It's exactly where history left it. It's physical evidence of a documented, transformative connection. These small metal discs prove ancient borders were fluid, that cultures could meet, clash, and then merge into something new. They remind us globalization isn't modern. It's an ancient practice, stamped in silver and gold, buried in the soil. telling the story of a time when a Greek king ruled an Indian realm, and his currency showed the complicated truth of that world. They found a stone tablet in a Tennessee valley. It was in a quiet place. This was back in 1889. Researchers were digging in a burial mound near Bat Creek. It was a Cherokee site, centuries old. In the soil, with other things, they found a small, flat stone, about 5 inches long, and on it someone had carved a line of characters. The discovery wasn't much at first, but then decades later, in the 1960s, a researcher looked at it again. He made a claim. He said the inscription wasn't Cherokee. It wasn't any Native American script. He said it was Paleo-Hebrew. That's an ancient writing from the Levant, from around the time of the First Temple. His translation read it as a phrase, for the Judeans, or for Judah. If that was true, it would change everything, a direct link, ancient Israelites in pre-Columbian North America. It would confirm a very old story. That story is the lost tribes of Israel. For centuries, since colonial times, European settlers looked at indigenous peoples here. They saw a mystery. Where did they come from? Some looked to the Bible. They found the story of the 10 tribes, the northern kingdom of Israel. They were dispersed by the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BC. They vanished. The theory said these tribes migrated across Asia. They eventually crossed into the Americas. This idea wasn't based on archaeology. It was a theological story. A way to fit the New World into an old biblical framework, and it was often used to justify colonial actions, to suggest these lost tribes had forgotten their true heritage. The Bat Creek stone seemed to be proof, a smoking gun. Some communities embraced it. Alternative historians saw it as validation, but academics were skeptical. Deeply skeptical, epigraphers, scholars of ancient writing, did an analysis. They compared the Bat Creek characters with real Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions. The differences were clear. The shapes were crude. The spacing was awkward. Some characters were mirror images of the real letters, as if copied from an illustration without understanding the script's direction. And the specific phrase claimed for the translation, it wasn't a common Paleo-Hebrew formulation. It felt like letters assembled, not a coherent inscription. Native American scholars added context. The mound was unquestionably Cherokee. The other items found with it, bone pins, pottery, were consistent with that culture. There was no other evidence of Hebrew material, no technology, no practice at the site. It was an isolated thing, an anomaly. Many concluded the stone was modern. Made in the late 1800s, a time of public fascination with mound builders and biblical mysteries, it could have been a hoax or a sincere attempt by someone to create evidence for a theory they believed. This case is a lesson. It shows how an artifact gets entangled, caught in a web of desire, cultural longing, the human need for a story that connects dots across vast distances. That finds familiar roots in unfamiliar soil. That need is strong. The Bat Creek stone became a vessel for it. It was more than a rock with scratches. For some, it was a sacred relic, proof of a divine plan. For scholars, it was a test of method, rigor. Most experts now see it as a product of its time. A 19th century object reflecting 19th century theories, not an ancient voyage. It reminds us to ask 2 questions. What does the object actually say? Based on strict analysis of its form and context, and what do we want it to say? The history of archaeology has moments where the second question overpowers the first. The Bat Creek stone is a cautionary marker, a reminder. When we look into the past, we must be aware of the stories we are trying to find. The most profound discoveries often don't confirm our old myths. They challenge us to understand the world on its own terms, complex terms. The desire to find familiar stories in new soil is powerful, but the evidence doesn't always point to oceans or lost tribes. Sometimes it points to something quieter, more intimate. It points to a path through a marsh. In the 1970s, archaeologists in Somerset, England, were looking at an ancient wooden walkway. The Sweet Track, a pathway built by Neolithic people nearly 6,000 years ago across a wet, boggy landscape, and preserved in the peat right beside it, they found an axe head. Small, just a few inches long, but it was made of this beautiful green stone polished to a high sheen. It looked like jade. Scientific analysis confirmed it was jadeite. A rare stone, exceptionally hard, but the test showed something else. The chemical signature of the stone didn't match anything in Britain. It matched a source high in the Alps, in what's now northern Italy. So this small, perfect object had traveled over 1,000 miles, on foot, across a continent. This was 4,000 years before the Romans even thought of building roads. And it wasn't a tool for chopping wood. The edges were too delicate, the form too refined. Experts think it was a ceremonial object, a symbol of power and connection. In Neolithic Europe, items like this moved along social networks that linked distant communities. An alpine jade axe would have been a prestige gift. Passed from hand to hand, from group to group, over generations, each exchange cementing an alliance or sealing a marriage, honoring an agreement. Its value wasn't in what it could cut, but in what it represented. The story of its origin, the skill of its maker, the vast distance it had crossed. Think of that journey, a person or a series of people carrying this precious green stone. Over mountain passes, along river valleys, through forests and across plains, every step taken on foot, guided by knowledge passed down through oral tradition. They knew where to go, who to meet, what pathways were safe. This axehead is a single point of light, but it illuminates a whole web of relationships we can barely see. It shows a prehistoric Europe that wasn't isolated. Communities were in contact. Ideas and objects flowed along routes of trust and ritual. The Sweet Track itself was a local engineering marvel. A raised path through a difficult environment, and lying right beside it was an object from another world entirely, a continent away. That juxtaposition is profound. It tells us that 6,000 years ago, people were already thinking beyond their immediate horizon. They were trading not just for necessity, but for meaning. For beauty, for a connection to something distant and extraordinary. That polished green axe resting in the English peat is a quiet testament to the human urge to reach out, to exchange, to carry a piece of a faraway mountain into the heart of your own home. A green stone traveled from the Alps to England. That's one conversation. But a continent can talk to itself too. Across North America, another metal was moving, copper. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous cultures have a long history with it. For thousands of years, peoples like the Tlingit, the Haida, the Coast Salish worked native copper. They found nuggets in local rivers, in the mountains. They made tools from it, fishhooks, knives, but also they made objects of real cultural power. Bracelets, plates, headpieces, these weren't just ornaments. They were a physical form of wealth, a display of status, of lineage. The copper itself was considered alive, with a spirit. A large copper shield's value could be measured in canoes, in blankets, in the social standing it gave. This was a local tradition built on local sources. Then, something curious, in some of these coastal sites, archaeologists find pieces of copper that are different. The chemical signature doesn't match the local rivers of British Columbia or Alaska. It matches the great ancient source, the copper mines around Lake Superior in the Great Lakes region. That's a distance of over 2,000 miles as the crow flies. Across mountain ranges, forests, powerful rivers, a piece of Great Lakes copper worked into a traditional Northwest coast form found on the shore of the Pacific. This isn't a story of lost ships, it's a story of a network, a living system of trade and relationship that span the continent. Metallurgists use trace element analysis. They take a tiny sample of an ancient artifact and find its chemical fingerprint, like matching a fingerprint to a person. Each major geological source has a distinct signature. Lake Superior copper is different from Appalachian copper, different from Rocky Mountain copper. When they analyze these out-of-place pieces in the Northwest, the science is clear. The metal came from the Great Lakes, so someone, a long chain of someones, moved that raw material or that finished object across that distance. How did it travel? Not on wheels, no pack animals. It moved through the most sophisticated system on the continent, indigenous trade networks. These weren't random encounters. They were established, ritualized, governed by complex protocols. A nugget from Lake Superior might be traded south to peoples in the Mississippi Valley. From there, west to the Plains tribes, then north along the Rockies, or west through river corridors, reaching the plateau and then the coast. At each exchange, value was added. It might be shaped, combined with a ballon shell or dentalium, transformed. The object accumulated stories with every hand it passed through. By the time a copper pendant reached a chief on the coast, it carried the prestige of that journey. It spoke of alliances stretching from one ocean to the other. This is a different kind of mystery, less about a single artifact, more about a pattern. A quiet, constant hum of exchange connecting ecosystems and cultures. It shows that long before European contact, North America was crisscrossed with highways of commerce, of diplomacy. Invisible highways except for the objects they left behind. A piece of copper from Michigan, worn by a leader in Washington state, tells us these societies weren't isolated villages. They were participants in a continental economy. They understood value, they negotiated complex relationships, they desired the exotic, even when the exotic came from their own vast homeland. That shifts the perspective. The movement of artifacts isn't only about catastrophic voyages, it's also about the daily, generational work of connection. The truth is, a continent can feel small when its people are linked by trade, by marriage, by shared stories. That copper from the Great Lakes, resting on the Pacific shore, is a testament to an America that was deeply connected. A network of human relationships so strong it moved mountains, or pieces of them, from one sea to the other. That copper pendant moved across a continent, showing a network of human connection. But sometimes the influence travels in the idea, not the object. There's a dry plateau in southern Africa, and on it the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, a kingdom that was powerful from the 11th to the 15th centuries. The heart of a trading empire built on gold and ivory. From within those stone walls, archaeologists found carvings, the Zimbabwe Birds, soapstone statues. Each one on a tall column depicting a bird of prey, an eagle or a falcon, but it's stylized. The feathers are a textured pattern, and it has this unusual feature. Instead of bird's feet, it stands on what looks like the back of a crocodile. These weren't decorations, they were emblems of royal power, symbols of the king's authority, watching from the high walls of the capital. The birds are an African creation from the Shona culture, but their form starts a conversation. The idea of a stone bird of prey as a royal symbol, that's not common in sub-Saharan Africa. But it appears in other cultures connected by Indian Ocean trade. In Persia, the falcon was a symbol of kingship. Arab traders who came to Great Zimbabwe's markets knew that imagery. So the exchange is subtle. It's not that a Persian sculptor came and carved them. It's that the idea traveled, a merchant, a story. The concept of the falcon as supreme authority was seen or heard and then absorbed. The carvers of Great Zimbabwe took that seed and planted it in their own soil. They blended it, the crocodile a creature of the rivers, a symbol of the ancestors and the land. By placing the regal bird on the crocodile, they made a new statement, that the king's power was grounded in tradition, in the earth of his people. This is how cultural exchange works at a sophisticated level. It's not replacement, it's fusion. The Zimbabwe birds show that exotic influence can be subtle. It arrives as a spark, a suggestion, and a confident culture takes that spark and uses its own fuel to create a unique flame. The birds are not Persian, they are not Arab, they are completely Zimbabwean, but their existence whispers of a kingdom open to the world, a kingdom that listened to stories from across the ocean and then told its own, more magnificent version. They remind us that great art often sits at a crossroads, where local genius meets a global idea and transforms both into something timeless. The fusion of ideas across oceans shows a world in conversation. But sometimes a discovery seems to shout a single, clear answer. Only the truth is far more complicated. In the early 20th century, workers in Moodus, Connecticut were excavating for a road. They uncovered a burial. The remains were of an individual laid to rest with metal objects. Among them was a sword, a style that looked to the observers at the time distinctly Norse. There was also a shield boss, the central metal dome from a round shield. The immediate interpretation was electrifying. This was a Viking, a Norse explorer buried far inland in North America. The so-called Headless Viking of Connecticut became a local legend. It seemed to be the physical proof so many were seeking, a warrior from the sagas resting in New England soil. The story fit a powerful narrative. For decades it was accepted as a fascinating anomaly. Modern science, however, has a way of re-examining our stories. Forensic anthropology and archaeological method have advanced. When experts later reassessed the burial, the narrative began to unravel. The critical element was context. The burial was not in an isolated, ancient layer. It was found within a colonial-era cemetery, dating to the 17th or 18th centuries. The style of the sword, on closer analysis, was not a Viking-era weapon. It was a type of European broadsword, common among colonial militias and officers in the 1600s. The shield boss, too, was consistent with equipment from that later period. The individual was almost certainly not a Norse explorer from the year 1000. They were far more likely a colonial soldier or settler from the 1600s. The headless condition wasn't evidence of battle. It was a result of preservation, the passage of time. The initial misidentification was a product of its era, a time of great public fascination with Vikings. And a less rigorous approach to contextual archaeology. Researchers saw what they hoped to find, connecting dots across centuries because the story was so compelling. This case is a masterclass in why context is everything. An artifact alone, a sword in the ground, is just an object. Its meaning comes from its surroundings. The soil layer it rests in, the other items buried with it, the manner of the burial itself. Modern tools like stratigraphic analysis, radiocarbon dating, forensic study of the remains. They allow scientists to build a clearer picture. They can examine wear patterns on the sword, study the chemical composition of the metals, analyze the skeletal remains for ancestry, health, diet. These techniques collectively told a different story, different from the initial rush of excitement. The Headless Viking of Connecticut stands as a crucial cautionary tale. It highlights a human tendency, even among early researchers, to fit new evidence into pre-existing, desired narratives. The desire to confirm the Viking presence in New England was strong. For a time, this burial served that purpose, but rigorous science must act as a corrective force. It asks us to follow the evidence, even when it leads to a less sensational conclusion. The truth of this burial, a colonial individual laid to rest with the tools of their time, is no less historically valuable. It tells a story of conflict, settlement, life in early America. It reminds us that the real work of history isn't about finding proof for our legends. It's about listening to the quieter, more complex stories the past is actually telling us. They found chicken bones in Chile at a site called El Arenal. These bones were old, radiocarbon dating put them between 1,300 and 1,400. That's before Columbus. Before any Spanish ships arrived. And then there was the genetics. The initial DNA work showed something. It linked these bones to chickens from Polynesia. Not to European breeds, that was the finding. So the idea was this. Polynesian voyagers had reached South America. They were deep ocean navigators. They read stars and swells. They traveled between tiny islands across the whole Pacific. It seemed plausible, inevitable even. There was already a clue, the sweet potato. It's an American crop. But it was found in Polynesia before European contact. That suggested an exchange. The chicken bones could have been the other side of it, physical proof. This discovery was big. It pointed to a pre-Columbian connection across the Pacific, a meeting of ancient seafaring peoples. The chicken was like a tiny ambassador. But then other researchers looked again. They used newer, more precise genetic techniques, and some doubts emerged. The DNA sequences might not be so clear. They could potentially match some European breeds too. Questions about contamination came up. Could later chickens have affected the old samples? The debate got technical. It's ongoing. Some papers support the Polynesian link. Others urge caution. They point to gaps in the data, complexities in the archaeology. This is how science works. A bold claim is made, then it gets tested from every angle. The community looks for corroboration. It demands reproducibility. So the El Arenal chicken is now a case study in how understanding evolves. A world-altering idea can rest on a bone fragment, and that fragment has to withstand scrutiny. Over time, today, there's no settled consensus. Many experts still find the Polynesian connection compelling, especially with the sweet potato evidence. Others are skeptical. They're waiting for a definitive, uncontested sample. What this teaches is about interpretation. A chicken bone isn't just a bone. In one reading, it's a testament to human courage on the open ocean. In another, it's a reminder of how timelines can get tangled. It holds a tension between a beautiful story and a verifiable fact, and in that tension you see history. It's not a list of settled answers, it's a living conversation. Across generations, every new tool, every new dig adds another voice. A single word can change a story, but an inscription could change history. That Bat Creek stone is part of a pattern. Other stones have been found here in the U.S. Markings on them. People say they're ancient scripts, Iberian script, Celtic Ogham, Libyan. If any of them were real, it would be a revolution. One slab of rock could prove that visitors from the ancient Mediterranean walked these woods. Long before Columbus, the allure is deep. It speaks to a curiosity. Who got here first? But going from a curious mark to a certified fact is difficult. It's governed by a field, epigraphy, the study of ancient inscriptions. Its standards are strict. They come from a century of learning how to separate the real from the mistaken, from the fake. An epigrapher doesn't just see a shape and say it looks like a letter. They analyze the whole system, the direction of the writing, the grammar, the syntax, the specific tool marks left by the engraver, the weathering on the stone itself. They compare it to a vast database, known, real inscriptions from that culture, and this is where almost all of these American finds fail. The characters show glaring problems. Letters might be mirror images of their true forms. They might be arranged in a way that makes no linguistic sense, like random symbols strung together. The style of carving might be wrong for the time period. One linguist said it's like someone copied letters from a foreign alphabet without understanding the language behind them. The result is gibberish dressed up as scripture. Then there's the issue of context. An artifact doesn't exist in a vacuum. If ancient Iberians had sailed to Tennessee, they wouldn't have left just one inscribed stone. They would have left a footprint, their pottery, their metalwork, their tools, their settlement patterns, their impact on the local environment. Archaeologists call this the associated material culture. For a real Old World inscription to be accepted, it has to be found in a sealed, datable layer, surrounded by other evidence of that foreign presence. So far, not one of these controversial inscriptions has met that standard. They are almost always surface finds, discovered by amateurs with no documented context. They appear alone, as if dropped from the sky. That isolation is, for specialists, the most telling clue. History is messy. It leaves clusters of evidence. Not single, perfect anomalies. The principle here is a cornerstone of scientific reasoning. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. A claim that rewrites the history of a continent is extraordinary. The proof has to be ironclad. It has to withstand scrutiny from multiple independent experts. It has to be reproducible and contextual. The absence of that context isn't a minor detail. It's almost always the decisive factor, so these stones teach a nuanced lesson. They remind us of a powerful desire to find familiar stories in an unfamiliar past. But they also highlight the rigorous work of real historical discovery. It's not built on a single moment. It's built on patient accumulation, interconnected evidence. The truth of the past is rarely written on one stone. It's woven into the soil, waiting to be pieced together, fragment by careful fragment. They found it in a shipwreck. Off the coast of Antikythera, a lump of bronze and wood all corroded together. It sat in a museum for years, just a curiosity. Then they looked inside with X-rays, with CT scans. And they saw it was a machine, a clockwork device, more than 30 interlocking bronze gears. This is the Antikythera Mechanism, from the 2nd century before the Common Era. An ancient analog computer built to model the cosmos. Its purpose was prediction. You'd turn a hand crank, and that would advance a series of dials on the front and the back. The dials showed the positions of the sun and the moon, the phases of the moon, the movements of the 5 planets the Greeks knew. It predicted eclipses. It even accounted for the moon's irregular orbit. This wasn't just a calendar. It was a dynamic representation of the heavens, built from metal. The knowledge in its gears is a map. The eclipse predictions use a cycle the Babylonian astronomers developed centuries earlier. The engineering, that's from the advanced mechanics of the Greek Hellenistic world. The inscriptions show a blend of astronomical traditions. Scholars see it as a physical synthesis, a meeting point, Babylonian observational data, Greek geometrical theory. Maybe technical ideas from other Mediterranean cultures. It's the pinnacle of Hellenistic science, a masterpiece that seems to appear from nowhere, and that's the real mystery. Its existence hints at a lost world, of technical manuals, of workshops, a lineage of these devices. The mechanism is too sophisticated to be the first of its kind. It implies a tradition, a school of thought that built these philosophical machines. That knowledge had to travel, the precise math, the gear ratios. The understanding of celestial cycles. It traveled from Babylonian clay tablets to Greek workshops, through trade routes, through the libraries of Alexandria, through the minds of scholars and artisans, people who could translate abstract numbers into tangible bronze. This artifact teaches something. Sometimes the most exotic discovery isn't the object's physical journey from one place to another. It's the journey of the knowledge it contains. The Antikythera Mechanism is a vessel. It carried a fused, international understanding of the universe. Across 2,000 years to us, its rusted gears still turn in our imagination, asking what other pinnacles of ancient wisdom were built and used and lost, leaving only a single miraculous survivor in the silent depths. The deepest connections can come from the smallest things, a little shell. Glossy, about the size of a fingernail, the cowry, that shape is so specific, like a smooth almond with a slit underneath. You see it and you know it. For thousands of years, these shells, from the Indian Ocean, from West Africa, They keep showing up in places that don't make sense, in old graves in Scandinavia, in Bronze Age dirt in Britain, in medieval towns in Hungary, thousands of them. Just this simple object, but it traveled an incredible distance, finding them there in prehistoric Europe, in medieval Europe. It's proof of a trade network, huge, and it lasted so long. These weren't just trinkets, they were money, one of the first global currencies, and it lasted. Economic anthropologists talk about why they worked. They were uniform. One shell from the Maldives looked just like the next one. They were durable. They didn't rot, they were hard to fake, and they all came from one faraway place, which meant if you controlled that source, you had real power. Their value was an idea. Cultures agreed on it, even if they'd never seen that ocean. A farmer in Central Europe might trade with these shells. He wouldn't know where they started. But he knew what they were worth. Their trip to Europe was this long chain, harvested in the Indian Ocean, then bundled, shipped north through the Middle East, along parts of the Silk Road, across the Sahara with Berber caravans, into North Africa, then into the Mediterranean and further, passing through so many hands. And each time what they meant could change a little. In some parts of Europe they became ornaments, sewn onto clothes for status, for protection. In other places they went into graves. Maybe as money for the afterlife, or as a charm. Their sameness made them trusted. Their distant origin made them magical. This went on for thousands of years. From the Bronze Age straight through the medieval period, these shells just kept moving along trade routes. They connected a Pacific archipelago to a Viking chieftain's rituals in Norway. They linked markets in Zanzibar to an alpine village. It was an early kind of globalization, running on trust. In this simple, beautiful object, it makes you think about evidence. We look for the big things, swords, statues, tablets, but sometimes the strongest proof is the common thing, the thing that's everywhere, in such huge numbers that its story is just there. These shells are like dust in a sunbeam. They show the currents, the huge, invisible currents of human exchange, always crisscrossing the world. They're a reminder. Long before coins, before paper, value could sit right in your palm, a piece of a distant sea carried over continents on a journey of shared belief. A slab of greywacke stone came up from the roots of a tree in Minnesota. This was 1898. The finder was Olof Oman, a farmer, a Swedish immigrant. On its face were carved these strange, angular characters. Runes. They told a story of Norse explorers far from home. The inscription told of a party, 8 Swedes and 22 Norwegians, on an exploration journey from Vinland. It described a tragic event. They had left their ships camped by a lake with 2 skerries. 10 men were red with blood and dead. It was dated in runic numerals to the year 1362. That was the Kensington Runestone. If it were real, it would change everything. It put Scandinavians deep in North America, over a century after the Norse Greenland settlements faded. A full 130 years before Columbus, the discovery started a firestorm. For the Scandinavian immigrant communities in the Midwest, it was a source of immense pride. It gave them a deep, heroic history right here in their new land. It connected them physically to the legendary Viking explorers. The stone was celebrated. It was displayed, debated. It became a local treasure and a national controversy. But from the start, scholars of Old Norse and runic inscriptions had serious doubts. Runology is precise. The evolution of runic alphabets is mapped century by century. The language on the Kensington stone was the first problem. Experts saw a strange mixture. Rune forms from different centuries, different regions. Some were medieval, others were from a much older alphabet. The grammar and phrasing were odd. It read like modern Swedish forced into runic script, not like natural 14th century Old Norse. The text used words and numerical concepts that didn't exist in the Norse language of that time. One runologist said it was like someone trying to write a telegram in a language they only half remembered. Then, the tool marks. Under magnification, the carving showed signs of modern, sharp metal tools. Not the chisels and hammers a medieval traveler would have carried. The weathering seemed inconsistent, too. The grooves of the runes looked fresh compared to the stone's natural surface. That suggested a much more recent creation. The historical context had its own problems. There's no archaeological evidence, no settlements, no tools, no other artifacts for a Norse expedition into Minnesota in the 1300. The Greenland colonies were struggling by then, isolated, in decline. A large, well-equipped party traveling thousands of miles inland is, based on all other evidence, highly improbable. The academic consensus is overwhelming. The Kensington Runestone is not a medieval artifact. It's a product of the late 19th century, but why it was made, that's where it gets insightful. This wasn't necessarily a malicious hoax for money. Many historians see it as a form of cultural myth-making. Olaf Oman and his community were immigrants. They were carving out a new life in a landscape that could feel foreign. By discovering or creating this stone, they were carving a Norse legacy right into the American soil. It was a way to claim belonging, to assert their ancestors had been there first. It rooted their new American identity in a story of ancient heroism and exploration. The stone gave them a past in a place that seemed to lack one for them. So the Kensington Runestone teaches a lesson about the stories we tell ourselves. It shows how the need for a meaningful origin can shape the evidence we find, or even create it. It stands as a monument not to 14th century Vikings, but to the hopes of 19th century immigrants. It reminds us that our search for the past is always, in part, a reflection of our present needs. The stone's true legacy isn't a rewritten history of exploration. It's a case study in how modern identities are forged and how powerfully the desire for a connection to antiquity can manifest. Gold tells a story of movement. Across the steppes from the Black Sea all the way to the Altai Mountains, there's a trail left behind by the Scythians. They were out there from about the 9th to the 3rd century BCE. They lived on horseback, they dominated the grasslands, and yet what they left is permanent, buried. These mounds, called kurgans, they rise up from the land. And inside them there's gold, intricate work, belt buckles, necklaces, combs, vessels, all in gold. And what's remarkable is how consistent it is. A gold plaque from southern Siberia shows a coiled panther. And it looks like family to a golden stag found near the Black Sea. Thousands of miles apart, this isn't a random collection. It's a signature, a coherent world spread out. Historians call it the Scythian animal style. Animals in motion, stags, eagles, panthers, griffins, swirling, contorted poses, full of energy. The style is unmistakable. And its presence across that huge territory tells you something. The Scythians weren't a single empire, not a capital city. They were a confederation of tribes, connected by a shared way of life, shared rituals, a shared elite culture. This gold was the glue. A chieftain buried near the Black Sea would have objects stylistically identical to a leader in the frozen Altai. That suggests an aristocracy connected across the continent. They traded, they intermarried, they shared artistic conventions. Craftspeople traveled with the tribes. The creation of the pieces speaks to a network. The gold came from multiple sources, from Central Asian mountains, Caucasus rivers. The techniques granulation, filigree show artistry that rivals any settled civilization. That challenges an old assumption that sophisticated art only comes from settled societies, from cities and palaces. The Scythians prove a mobile, pastoral life could foster its own pinnacles. Its own complex cosmology expressed in metal. Their gold wasn't just wealth, it was identity, power, a spiritual bridge. The animals they depicted weren't just decoration. They were clan totems, divine protectors, symbols of the natural world they lived in. You look at a gold pectoral from Ukraine with scenes of mythical combat. Then you see a nearly identical motif on a belt buckle from Kazakhstan. You're not looking at displaced artifacts, you're looking at a map of a connected nomadic civilization. Their territory wasn't fixed borders, it was horizons. Their gold moved with them, and in its consistent, beautiful form, it wove the steppes together. A single cultural tapestry. It reminds you that human connection can flourish on the move. What's left behind isn't crumbling walls, it's timeless treasures. Whispering of a world united by the gallop of horses and the gleam of metal under a boundless sky. The Scythians carried their gold with them. It moved across the steppe. But some of the most important travelers in the ancient world didn't need bags or horses. They were plants. Take the sweet potato. It comes from the Americas. That's its origin, but when Europeans got to Polynesia in the 1700s, the sweet potato was already there. It was growing, and the Polynesian word for it is kumara. That sounds a lot like the word for the same tuber in Quechua, the language from the Andes. That's not a random accident, it's a clue written in plants and in language. It points to a voyage across the Pacific, and it happened before Columbus. The transfer probably went both ways. The coconut palm, it's from Southeast Asia. But it was already growing on the Pacific coasts of the Americas when the Spanish showed up. So how did it get there? These plants are biological artifacts. Their spread is evidence, a quiet kind of evidence, and now bioarchaeologists trace it through genetics. They look at the DNA of modern sweet potatoes across the Pacific. They compare it to ancient samples. They can map a family tree, and that tree shows a branch that crossed the ocean long before the 1500s. That changes the whole conversation. It moves it from lost artifacts to living things. It raises a practical question. Could a sweet potato cutting survive a trip of thousands of miles on an open canoe? Or a coconut? Botanists and anthropologists think so. Polynesian voyaging canoes were sophisticated. They carried people. They also carried a kind of portable ecosystem. Taro, breadfruit, yams, animals. A tuber wrapped in damp moss could be part of that cargo. A coconut is its own perfect vessel, food and water inside. It could easily have been carried. The implication is huge. It means the most successful exchanges between worlds might not have been gold or weapons. They might have been food, a single successful transfer of a staple crop that could reshape a society's whole diet, its agriculture, its resilience. The sweet potato is rich in calories. It's adaptable. It became a cornerstone across Polynesian islands. Its arrival was a quiet revolution, far more impactful than any stray coin. This living evidence forces a wider view of contact. It wasn't necessarily empires meeting or battles. It could have been a single canoe, blown off course by a storm. Making landfall, the crew sharing a meal with new faces, a tuber traded, then planted, then thriving. From that small, organic exchange, a new chapter grew. A chapter rooted in the earth itself. It reminds you, the deepest connections are often the ones that feed you, that sustain communities for generations. They leave their mark not in museum cases but in the soil, in the words we use for our food. The objects that traveled farthest were often ideas. In Ireland, in the waterlogged bogs, there's a different kind of discovery. Not coins, not swords, people, the bog bodies, preserved for over 2,000 years by the peat. They're local, from that soil, and yet some were found with items that suggest a world beyond the horizon. Galog man in County Galway. He was laid to rest with 2 long, sharpened wooden stakes pinning him down, and with several slender willow rods. At first, these seem simple. Local materials, but their arrangement, the deliberate placement, it speaks a language. A ritual language archaeologists recognize from far away. The use of wooden stakes to secure a body, or binding with woven rods, it finds echoes in other bog sites. In Denmark, in Germany, these aren't imported artifacts. They're local expressions of a shared spiritual vocabulary that points to a different connection. Not trade in goods, but an exchange of ideas, a transmission of ritual practice across the Celtic and Germanic worlds of the Iron Age. How did it travel? Maybe not in ships, but along the same routes that moved amber, salt, and metal, with traders, with travelers, with families moving between communities. A story about how to honor the gods or deal with a crisis could spread as surely as any commodity. Specialists who study these remains, they work with immense care. They see each body as a unique individual, a story that ended in a specific, often difficult moment, but they also look for patterns, the placement of the body, the nature of objects nearby, the cause of death. These patterns form a map, not of political borders, but a map of belief. It shows regions where communities, separated by distance and language, were grappling with similar spiritual questions. Questions about sacrifice, about the boundary between the human world and the other world, about ensuring fertility or appeasing powers beyond their control. Those willow rods with Galog Man might symbolize binding or a protective barrier. Similar concepts appear in other rituals. This doesn't mean a priest from Germany came to Ireland to direct it. It suggests that within the interconnected tapestry of Iron Age Europe, communities arrived at similar symbolic solutions. They shared a way of thinking about the sacred, expressed through the materials at hand. So the exotic connection here is ideological. It's the movement of a concept. The proof isn't in a foreign-made object, but in the familiar made strange through deliberate, patterned use. The bog bodies and their items remind us that the most profound things humans carry aren't always physical. They're the stories we tell, the fears we share, the rituals we create to make sense of life and its ending. These ideas could cross mountains and rivers, taking root in new soil, and leaving behind in the quiet peat a record not of empire but of a shared, searching human spirit. They found a bronze mirror on the Alaskan coast, not at a trading post. It was at a prehistoric Eskimo site, a place called Punyik Point, a dwelling. The mirror is small, about the size of a hand. On its back, a classic Chinese design, likely from the Song or Yuan dynasty, that puts it between the 10th and 14th centuries. So you have this object from the sophisticated courts of China, sitting in a house pit above the Arctic Circle. It's a physical bridge cast in metal. The journey it took is a map. It almost certainly didn't travel straight from a Chinese ship to Alaska. It moved along a relay system. A middleman trade network, a chain across Siberia. A mirror like this, maybe a diplomatic gift or a luxury item on the northern Silk Road, would have moved northeast. Hand to hand, community to community, across that daunting landscape, Siberia, until it reached the Bering Strait, that narrow gap, and it crossed over into the trade networks of indigenous Alaska. This was a filter. Objects of value trickled through, along routes used for obsidian, furs, ivory. To see its value, you need two perspectives. For the Chinese artisan, it was a practical object of beauty. Symbols of harmony, longevity. For the person who last held it in Alaska, its meaning changed. Its most obvious property was reflectivity. In a world without glass, a polished metal surface that could capture a likeness. That would have been profound. It might have been seen as a capturing device for spirit, for essence, a portal, a source of protective power. That shiny surface could have been associated with the sun. With light, with vision, both literal and spiritual, it wouldn't have been just a trinket, it would have been a potent item, maybe for a shaman, a high-status object that spoke of connections. To powerful forces, to distant peoples, experts point to its fragility. Bronze can corrode, it can break. The fact it survived the journey intact shows how carefully it was handled. It was cherished. Each person who passed it along recognized its significance, protecting it across tundra, through forests, over frozen seas. They found it in a dwelling site, not a grave. So it was part of daily life, a functional piece of spiritual or social technology. This one artifact in the Alaskan soil encapsulates an idea. It traces a path of human desire through the coldest regions. It shows the drive for the exotic, for the beautiful, for the magical, could motivate trade across the most formidable barriers. The Bering Strait wasn't just a boundary. It was a filter, a gateway, and through it passed for millennia the artifacts of interconnected lives. The Chinese mirror in Alaska is a witness to a conversation between continents, conducted not with words but with objects, passed from one curious hand to another, across the roof of the world. A stone tower stands in a quiet park in Newport, Rhode Island. It's circular, built of rough fieldstone, thick walls, arched windows, a fireplace inside. For over a century, this structure has been at the center of a debate. Is it a colonial windmill from the 1600s, or is it something older? Could it be a Norse church, a Viking beacon, built before Columbus? This is the Newport Tower. Its story shows how romantic speculation can grow around a simple, sturdy building. The tower's documented history begins in the colonial era. The first written reference appears in the late 1600s. Town records from 1677 call it my stone mill. Wills and deeds describe it as part of Benedict Arnold's property, the colonial governor, not the later traitor. Arnold's will from 1678 leaves my stone-built windmill to his heirs. That paper trail is clear, it's contemporary. Architectural historians look at its design. They compare it to known stone windmills from 17th century England, from Lincolnshire. The arched windows, the central post hole for the grinding mechanism, the fireplace for the miller. These are features of a practical, working mill from that period. It fits into the world of early New England industry, yet the mystery persists because of how it looks. To the modern eye, it doesn't look like a stereotypical wooden Dutch windmill. Its circular form and arched openings feel ancient, even medieval. That visual cue sparked other theories. In the 1830s, a Danish scholar proposed it was a Norse structure, built by explorers like Leif Erikson. He argued the architecture resembled round churches from Scandinavia. The idea took root, other theories followed. Maybe it was built by Portuguese explorers or the Knights Templar. Each theory latched onto a detail, a niche that might be an altar, a window alignment said to mark a solstice. Archaeology has stepped in to test these stories. Multiple excavations around the tower's base have been done. The findings are consistent. The soil layers show no evidence of a medieval settlement. The artifacts are all from the 17th and 18th centuries: clay pipes, colonial pottery, nails. Nothing from the Viking Age, nothing from the 1300s or 1400s. If Norsemen had built a permanent stone structure like this, they would have left a footprint, tools, hearths, distinctive artifacts. That evidence is completely absent. The lesson of the Newport Tower is this: it shows how a later, functional building can become shrouded in time. When the original purpose fades, we project our own mysteries onto the stones. The tower's sturdy, archaic-looking form invites stories of ancient voyages. It fulfills a desire for proof of legendary explorers here, but the historical and archaeological record tells a quieter tale. It was a windmill built by colonial hands for grinding corn. Its true story is one of adaptation and utility in a new world. that doesn't make the tower less fascinating. It shifts the wonder. The wonder is in how a simple mill could inspire such enduring legends. It becomes a monument not to Norse sailors, but to the human love of a good mystery. It reminds us to listen to the documents, to the layers of earth, as carefully as we listen to the allure of a grand tale. Sometimes the truth is ordinary. And in that ordinariness, it tells us just as much about who we are and the stories we need to believe. The last thing on this list isn't something you can touch. It's just a chemical trace, a ghost in the lab results. Back in the 90s, a team of researchers made an announcement. They'd tested hair and tissue from some Egyptian mummies. And they found something that shouldn't be there, two specific compounds, nicotine and cocaine. Nicotine comes from tobacco, cocaine comes from the coca leaf. Both of these plants are native to the Americas. They weren't known in the Old World until after Columbus. Finding them in mummies that are thousands of years old would mean one thing: a transoceanic connection, active during the time of the pharaohs. It would be the most revolutionary evidence, not a coin, not a statue, a molecule. A molecule that should not be there. This is the ultimate scientific anomaly. It sits right where discovery meets doubt. The initial findings were met with immediate skepticism. Fierce skepticism from the mainstream academic community. The debate that followed shows how modern science handles an extraordinary claim. On one side, the researchers argued their methods were sound. They used gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, standard tools for identifying chemical compounds. They detected these molecules deep within the tissue, not just on the surface. They said that ruled out modern contamination. Like a careless archaeologist smoking near the artifacts decades ago, the other side had toxicologists, chemists, Egyptologists. They raised serious methodological questions. They pointed to the possibility of contamination during the long curation of these mummies. For over a century, these remains were stored in museums, handled by countless people, exposed to airborne particles in environments that weren't sterile. Could a molecule of nicotine from a 19th century curator's pipe have settled into the tissue? Bonded over time, it's a plausible scenario. There's also the possibility of a false positive. Could other organic compounds from the mummification process break down? The resins, the oils, the plant materials, over millennia, could they create chemical signatures that mimic nicotine or cocaine under testing? Science is always discovering new things. Our understanding of ancient chemistry is incomplete. Egyptologists add a contextual argument. There's a mountain of evidence from ancient Egypt: wall paintings, botanical remains, medical papyri. They meticulously document the flora they knew and used. Not a single depiction or mention of tobacco or coca exists in that entire record. For a culture that documented everything, the absence is deafening. So we're left with a stalemate, a set of data points that, if verified, would force a complete rethinking of ancient global networks, and a set of scientific criticisms that, if valid, show how easily such data can be misinterpreted. This final mystery represents a frontier. It moves the search from the tangible to the molecular. It forces us to confront the limits of our tools, the limits of our current knowledge. Maybe future technology, more precise, will settle the debate. It might confirm the findings, open a door to a past far more interconnected than we thought. Or it might definitively close it, attribute the signals to the complex chemistry of time itself. But the value of this controversy isn't in a final answer. It's in the question. It shows that the pursuit of history is never truly finished. It's a living process: inquiry, challenge, revision. These 25 artifacts, from Roman coins to chemical traces, they're not just curiosities. They're a collective reminder. The map of human history isn't a finished drawing. It's a parchment still being filled in. With every dig, every scan, every test, we add a line. or erase an old assumption. The story is still being written, and the most astonishing chapters may still be waiting, hidden in the soil or in the very atoms of the past. These artifacts, bronze mirrors, jade axes, they start to form a pattern. They aren't random, they fall into categories. Each one tells us something about how the ancient world connected. The first category is trade goods, objects made to be moved, to hold value across cultures. Chinese porcelain on African beaches, Roman coins in Japan. Cowry shells in Europe, these were commodities. Their value was agreed upon, sometimes as currency, sometimes as a luxury. They traveled along established routes. The silk roads of the sea and the steppe. Then there are prestige items. These weren't mass-produced. They were singular objects made from rare materials. The Alpine jade axe in England, that's an example. It wasn't a tool for chopping, it was a symbol. Its value came from its beauty, from how hard it was to obtain. From the story of its distant origin, these items moved through a different network: elite gift exchange, diplomacy, marriage alliances, passing from one leader to another. Each exchange cementing a social bond. A third pattern is stylistic influence. This is subtler. It's an idea that travels. The Zimbabwe birds show this. The concept of a bird of prey as a royal emblem. That idea may have arrived from across the Indian Ocean, but the local artists made it their own. They placed it on the back of a crocodile. Something rooted in their own land. This is cultural diffusion. It's not about an object being out of place. It's about a motif finding a new home and transforming. Understanding these patterns helps. It separates the systemic from the sensational. Most verified long-distance finds fit here: trade, prestige, or influence. They move through documented processes. Historians describe a mechanism, down-the-line trade. An object doesn't make a single epic journey from Rome to Japan. Instead, it passes from one community to the next, like a baton in a relay race across generations. Each hand-off is a local transaction. Over centuries, the baton can travel astonishing distances. Even if no single person knew the full map, this is how we map the faint networks, the ones that truly wove the ancient world together. They were driven by fundamental human desires. For resources, for status, for new knowledge. A community in Britain desired the spiritual power in a green stone from the Alps. A Swahili merchant sought the gleaming status of Chinese porcelain. A Scythian chieftain required gold worked in a specific animal style, a style that proclaimed his place in a vast nomadic aristocracy. These desires created currents, and objects floated along those currents. When we find them far from home, they are not mere anomalies. They are buoys marking the channels of a hidden geography. A geography of human connection. It was fragile, intermittent, but incredibly persistent. It was a world where a Polynesian voyager might trade for a sweet potato, where a Norse coin could become a pendant in Maine, where an artistic solution in one hemisphere could echo in another. This synthesis turns a cabinet of curiosities into a coherent story. It reveals that our ancestors were not isolated. They were participants in a slow, vast, and whispering conversation, a conversation whose fragments we are still assembling. One unexpected discovery at a time, that whispering conversation across continents. It leaves you with a sense of scale. We've gone through 25 artifacts. And what they show is a world that's far more dynamic, far more connected than what you usually find in a textbook. A Roman coin ends up as a treasure in a Japanese castle. The symbol of an African king gets its shape from stories out of Persia. A simple sweet potato bridges the whole Pacific. These aren't just scattered curiosities. They're notes, individual notes in a grand, ancient symphony. A symphony of human movement, of exchange. You have verified things like Ming porcelain. And then you have the mysteries like the Fuente Magna bowl. And each piece, each one, challenges that comfortable idea. the idea of ancient civilizations as isolated. Separate, it forces you to replace that map, the map with the walled-off cultures. You replace it with a different vision, a world crisscrossed by threads. Faint threads but resilient ones, threads of commerce, of diplomacy, shared ideas, and sometimes just astonishing voyages into the complete unknown. This new map is messy, it's incomplete, full of questions, and that's what makes it compelling. You have to navigate carefully. There's solid ground, rigorous evidence. And then there are the cliffs, the seductive cliffs of speculation. But the weight of these discoveries collectively, it's undeniable. It invites you to embrace a different past. A more complex one, a more adventurous one, frankly, a more interesting human past where curiosity and courage propelled people, propelled their possessions. Across deserts, across mountains, across trackless oceans, history, seen this way, isn't a fixed story. It's not written in stone. It's a living puzzle. One we're constantly reassembling, piece by unexpected piece, every new discovery in the soil, every new revelation in the lab.